All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine. Thank you very, very much for joining me on the first ever Screen Life Balance live Zoom call. I have never done this before, so I appreciate you joining me and doing this as kind of a test run together. And in fact, I'm going to ask my assistant Jen if she could text me, yes, on my phone, just to make sure that she can see me because I can't see any of you. So hopefully it's working. Let's see. Anyway, I wanted to give you a bit of a housekeeping stuff as we get started and as people trickle in here. Great. Okay. I'm good. She says I'm good. Basically, I'm hoping this will run for about 20 minutes. I've got a couple things to say to you guys that I hope will help you feel a little bit more calm in what is certainly an anxious and uncertain time. And I would love to take questions from you. The easiest ways to or way to do that, considering my I don't know, naivete when it comes to Zoom calls is to use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you write a question there, I will be able to see it. And also you can look in that field and upvote other people's questions that you really find that you want to have answered. So the first thing, and I literally have a notebook here with some thoughts. So we're just gonna see how this goes together. The first thing I wanted to say to you all is thank you very much for making the time to do this. And in this moment in time, I think it's important for us all to recognize that no matter what craziness is swirling around us in the world, in this particular moment, we are here together and you're okay. We don't know what the future is going to hold, but right now, right this second, you are alive and breathing and you're okay. And I also want to invite you to just take a moment to ground yourself here. I'm sure your thoughts are swirling like crazy. If you're like me, you're having trouble falling asleep at night because so much is going on. So I just want to invite you to take a deep breath with me. And by the way, I can't see any of you guys, so don't worry about being self-conscious about whatever you look like. But just take a deep breath and try to become aware of your physical body in space right now. Ready? We're just going to do it together. So just try to let out a little bit of whatever it is you're feeling. And remember that you can always do that whenever you're feeling chaotic in your head or that you just need some kind of grounding. You have your breath to come back to. I personally have found it really useful as a tactic to do a daily meditation. If you guys have ever in your life been interested in trying meditation, this is probably a good opportunity. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. There's plenty of meditation apps out there if you don't have one already. I actually highly encourage that as a really positive way to use screens. And all you need to do is try a mindfulness meditation for a couple of minutes. You can even just set a timer for yourself, like a kitchen timer, and just spend a few minutes every day trying to simply pay attention to your breath and trying to bring yourself back to your breath over and over again and recognize that your mind will run away multiple times during those few minutes and that it's totally normal. And that brings me to another point I wanted to make, which is that we all should really be trying our best right now to be kind to ourselves because we're all really stressed. We're all cooped up. We're all feeling a little bit crazy. And you don't want to start beating yourself up because that's just going to make things worse in your own head. So I wanted to talk specifically today about techniques you can use to try to stop compulsively checking the news because that is a huge issue right now. And I thought I'd start by attempting to explain a little bit about why we're doing this and why it's so compelling to check. Because if any of you guys have read my stuff, know I'm really into trying to understand the physiology behind our behaviors, because I think the more you understand about how your own body and brain works, the more control you'll end up being able to have. So let's see, I've never tried to explain this before, but in terms of the news, basically when we're stressed out, the part of our brain that's in charge of rational thought goes completely offline. It's kind of unfortunate. It's like in the moments when you might need it the most, the prefrontal cortex, that's the area of your brain that's in charge of this. It's like, see you later. I'm going to go hide under a rock. I'm going to let your primitive brain take over. The one that just has a fight or flight response, like keyed up and ready to go, and the one that's going to seek out really quick fixes to whatever anxiety you're going to feel. So for example, your rational brain might be like, Catherine, meditation, what a lovely idea. And then your more primitive brain is going to be like, that sounds hard. Why don't I just have a drink or do something else that's going to give you a very quick fix of something? And that quick fix doesn't actually need to be a substance. Basically, our brains are going to seek out rewards. And I'm putting that in quotes because the reward doesn't necessarily have to be a positive thing. They're going to seek out something that's going to trigger the release of a chemical in our brain called dopamine, which is our brain's way of establishing habits, our brain's way of recording when things are worth doing again. So anything that releases dopamine in your brain is going to be something you're going to turn to in moments of stress. So things like, alcohol or drugs most definitely activate the dopamine circuitry in your brain. But interestingly, the news does too, because novelty is a really big dopamine trigger. So every time you check the news and you find something new waiting for you, which you will every single time because it's the news, your brain's going to release a little bit of dopamine. And that's going to tell you, oh, that was a behavior I should keep doing. And it doesn't matter if the news that you get when you check the news is not actually helpful, if it actually makes you stressed out, or if it just breeds even more anxiety. Your brain chemistry does not care. It's just like, oh, I got a hit of that new stuff. I'm going to do it again. And also, it makes sense that we are trying to alleviate our anxiety by turning to the news, because doing internet searches, turning to the news, that's what we do when we try to find answers to things. We're hoping that when we turn on the TV or the radio, they're going to be like, hey, guess what? Pandemic is slowing down. Someone found a vaccine, or we found out that a common throat lozenge is going to cure this. We're after some kind of concrete answer. And of course, we're not finding that right now. And that's making our anxiety even higher, which in turn is making that rational part of your brain hide even further into that rock. And then that in turn is leaving you again with that primitive part of your brain that's like, I don't know what to do. Let me just keep checking. So that's what's going on. So what can you do about that? I mean, the first thing to do is actually recognize that that is what's happening, so that you can be like, okay, brain, see what you're doing. I'm going to choose to do something else. We need to chill out for a minute and choose something else. Now, there's some really concrete, and this is when I get my notebook, because I actually did write down a list here. It might be useful for me to go in my own order that I had. So the first thing I was going to suggest is actually take a second to come up with a plan for yourself, for your prefrontal cortex to come back online for a second, and for you to say, okay, I know I want to check the news. It is important to be informed to a certain degree, but I don't want to go crazy. So how many times am I going to check the news today? What sources am I going to use? Probably Facebook's not a good idea, guys. Don't listen to what your crazy uncle has to say about COVID. Maybe the CDC. So choose your sources. Choose how long you're going to spend checking those things, so that you have some kind of plan going in, so that you can't just instinctively turn to, again, that primitive brain part. Then you want to actually limit your access to the news. If you have the TV on in the background all the time, or if you have the radio on all the time in the background, you're just going to be constantly mainlining anxiety. And it's going to feel bad. And it's actually not that useful, because ask yourself, what is it actually giving you? Are you learning something useful? For example, if you tuned into your local station and you find out that you've got a shelter in place order and you've been about to go out to work, maybe that's useful. But we're all washing our hands and not touching our faces as much as we can. There's only so much more we can proactively do. So one of the big things I recommend that you try in terms of stopping or reducing your access to the news is get the news apps off your phone, which I know might sound like a drastic step. How are you possibly going to stay informed? But I want to guarantee you will stay informed, because we're all compulsively checking. And also, hopefully you just came up with a plan for yourself about when and where you're going to get your news. You can also keep in mind that if you wanted to reinstall those apps, you could do so 30 seconds after you uninstall them. Or if you decide that your phone is going to be the device through which you consume the news, you can always reinstall the app and then get out. But I highly recommend that you try not having them on your phone. I don't have the news on my phone at all. And of course, if you take the app off, you could go through the browser, and we'll get to that in a minute, but try to reduce your access to the cause of your stress. Another thing I highly recommend is that if you do keep any sort of news on your phone, you turn off notifications, or you adjust your notification settings so that you're not getting constant pings every time there's a new story, let alone from multiple news sources. I heard from someone who was saying that she got 5 alerts for news stories from different news sources that essentially were all the same story, and they all were very anxiety provoking. And as I mentioned in my newsletter, I myself had the experience of being in my basement, getting a text on my phone saying that the first case of corona virus had been found in Philadelphia. Well, great. I mean, I knew that was going to happen sometime. I'm in my basement already. Like, there's nothing I can do with that information other than now experience more anxiety than I was before. So experiment with turning off those notifications. I also find it useful to actually block my access to websites and apps that I find problematic. And I always recommend this particular app blocker. Totally changed my life. It's called Freedom. The URL is freedom.to. You should check it out. Basically what it does is it allows you to set block lists of particular apps and websites that you don't want to have access to during particular periods of time. I always get confused by which features are free and which ones are paid, because I have paid to have a subscription to this app forever, if that's is that useful. But essentially what I've done is I've set my freedom block so I can't get into the news from my phone, even if I type in the name of the newspaper into the URL in, say, Safari. It just doesn't work. And if I try it from my computer, I will get an image of a green butterfly that just says, "You are free." And it works across devices, which is fantastic. So kind of a hardcore option, but you can always quit out of Freedom if you don't want to be blocked from it. But I really find that that is very useful. And then the other suggestion I had that often people overlook is that if you're trying to change a habit, which in this case is changing the way we interact with the news, you have to have an alternative in place for yourself. Because again, anytime you're stressed, rational brain out the window, you're just going to go to whatever is closest and easiest. And so you want to make sure you've identified something that you want to do with your time, and then it's really easy to access it. So if that's something that's on your phone, and again, I think that there are positive things you can do with your phone right now. It would be something like a meditation app, or maybe Zoom, so you can call a friend. You could put a book on your bedside table. You could put a journal. I've put together writing prompts that you've gotten a link to in the Quarantine Challenge emails that have practices you can do at the beginning and the end of your day to try to frame your day in a bit of a more positive light despite everything that's going around. So try to make the things you want to be doing easy to access, and the things you don't want to be doing difficult to access. And I also want to encourage you, many of us are feeling so frantic right now and truly do not have free time in any big capacity, but we're clearly spending some time on the news, otherwise you wouldn't be on this call. And so one thing I've tried to do for myself is to actually proactively set a couple of goals for myself, quarantine goals I'm calling them, that I can aim towards with the time that I would otherwise have been spending on the news. And that can be really quite simple, like just go for a 10-minute walk. But if you have free time and you've had things that are on your list of things you supposedly want to do but don't have time for, maybe now is the time to do it. For some reason, the image of watercoloring is coming to my mind. And I don't mean to downplay the craziness of the moment, especially for parents of small kids. You're like, I don't have any free time. What is she talking about? But just consider whether or not there's something you can do with this news time that would leave you feeling more nourished and cared for by yourself. So I think that that is most of my suggestions. I'm going to turn it over to look at the Q&A in a second. I guess the other thing I did want to say is the idea of the practice is to start and end the day on your own terms, which I do think is something that's important to keep in mind. Because if you have your phone in your bedroom on your bedside table, chances are you're checking it first thing in the morning and last thing at night, and you're looking at something that is stressful. So it could be very helpful to get the phone out of your bedroom, turn the ringer on if you're worried about missing a call from somebody, and instead do a journal prompt writing something that lets you start and end on your own. And then also as you go through this and you get more practice, start to notice your own anxiety levels. Start to notice what things you're doing during the day that are spiking those anxiety levels and which things are lowering them a little bit. Because if you can get in that habit of noticing your own emotions and emotional state in the present moment, you will give yourself opportunities to change direction. You can say, okay, I've just read 17 articles on the news, I'm feeling a little bad, but I just noticed that. I'm not going to get mad at myself for it. Instead, I'm going to say, I choose to do something different instead. So I hope that is helpful. I'm going to look into this Q&A for a second to see what's there. And Jess, thank you for joining us. Feel free to share this with other people as well. And okay, Great. Oh my goodness. Okay, so someone says they are doing watercolor right now. Thank you, Michelle. That's fantastic. Got a backup vote for freedom. Um, let's see. What do I do about relatives or friends who want to discuss every new COVID update? I feel bad shutting them down, but I know I need something different. I think you can be gentle about it, but also protect yourself in it. I think that a lot of people are constantly bringing up coronavirus because it's top of mind for them, and they haven't really gone through the process that we're going through right now of saying, okay, yes, that is happening and it's terrifying, but there's only so much that we can control. So I would encourage you to perhaps gently mention that you are trying yourself to decrease your own stress around it and ask if you can talk about something else. In other words, I think there's a way to do it that's not like, stop talking about coronavirus, I can't deal with it anymore. And more like, would you join me in this experiment to try to turn our attention somewhere else just because my own anxiety levels are so high? And maybe again, have something that you can propose to them, like, could we go on a virtual walk together over Zoom, or could we discuss something else? Could we find, I don't know, personally, I've been hosting a lot of virtual dance parties on Zoom, which are completely ridiculous. Basically involves me dancing in my living room with friends, little videos showing up on my screen. But it's actually really wonderful to get out of your head. So I think suggesting concrete alternatives is also a great idea. And to that end, actually, a friend of mine is doing a virtual disco class tonight. I sent it in the last email, but it's at 8:30 tonight, and you can sign up at virtualdanceusa.com, I believe. And you can actually get totally out of your head and into your body by doing some disco dancing. I don't know. I'll be there, so it'd be lovely to actually see some of you there. All right, let's see. I'm seeing if there's any more questions. A lot of people saying they feel afraid of being alone with themselves and their ideas. I completely understand that, because our brains are crazy places. So whenever I go to mindfulness classes, I always appreciate when teachers say things like, your mind's going to wander and be stressful and jump around, because that's just what our minds do. So our minds can be scary places. I totally hear you on that. So perhaps maybe you can find some kind of nourishing book or some, I don't know, some activity that will actually get you out of your head in a way that feels healthy and kind to yourself. And I think that actually brings up a bigger point that I'm sure I'm going to mention in other webinars in more detail. But I've been trying to think about my own screen time in terms of 3 categories of C's. There's consumption, creation, and connection. And I think a lot of us are defaulting towards consumption. I know so many people who are streaming pandemic. I don't really get that. It seems extremely stressful to me. But anyway, there's certainly like a time and a place for just consuming content like Netflix. But you want to make sure that whatever you're consuming is actually soothing you, and you're not just constantly soothing the news and feeling worse and worse. And then you have the other 2 categories, which are creation and consumption. Creation and connection. And those are the 2 that I'm trying to focus on. How can I do things in my life with technology or without technology that will bring people together, make me feel more connected, and make me feel like I'm actually creating something positive? So if it's helpful at all to think about those categories as both ways to evaluate your own screen time or just to direct your attention, I offer that as well. I'm going to see if there's anything else in here. Just a couple suggestions from people. Lots of walks. Let's see. What station do I think is best to watch for COVID-19 updates? I actually don't really watch the news on TV myself. I would say to try to go as high level as possible. I mean, I do think checking the CDC or the World Health Organization those are good sources if you want like top level, vetted by scientists news of what's going on. I do not think it's helpful to read tons of editorials or to watch talking heads on TV, because they're just talking about information rather than giving you new information. And I also do recommend trying to find some reputable local news source that you trust, just in case there's something that you want to find out about in your local community, like, you know, changes to store hours or changes to rules about when you are allowed to go out or not. So anyway, we are at about 20 minutes. I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank you all so much for participating, for sending your comments. I'm looking forward to reading through these when I end this, and for being a part of this community. I can't tell you how helpful it's been to me myself to feel a sense of purpose in the past week. I'm a lot more sane because of all of you, and I really appreciate it. I hope to do these webinars regularly at 4 p.m. on Mondays, and I've also got some other ideas cooking, including a podcast that I will send information about that has to do with walking. And in the meantime, I would love to hear any suggestions you have for subjects for future webinars or anything else, ideas, suggestions, comments that you'd like to share with us, and we'll do our best to respond, and when appropriate, share it with a wider audience. So I will end this meeting, and I want to thank you again so much for being a part of our community. Take care, everyone.